Bonjour, merci. Dzień dobry, dziękuję. And for our international audience, I'm sorry to disappoint you, that's the end of the multilingual part of the presentation. And in fact, I'll begin with something of an apology. I'm going to be talking about the growth and changing in shelters, but it's very much an American story. And it's a story that's taken me 25 years to put together. And so I really haven't tried to figure out what's happening in the rest of the world. Now, one of the reasons why it's been hard to put the story together is the fact that, frankly, shelters were always somewhere in the part of town that nobody ever wanted to go. For years, I used to joke that if I was taken to a strange town I had never been to before, and they asked me to find the animal shelter, I'd ask, where's the town dump? So in many ways, based on what Dr. Lord talked about, even, that's where the feral dogs are, but that's actually where the dogs that we get rid of end up over in the shelter. The other option, if you're from the Northeast in America, is where do you park the snowplows? Because that's where the shelter is going to be. And it's also the place, as I say, we didn't want to think about what happened to animals that we no longer cared about. And it was sort of a dumping ground for many years. And the question is, how did we get there? How have things evolved? The first animal shelters were really in colonial America, and they were impounds for livestock. And what happened is, many times in town, people would keep some animals. You'd have chickens for food and eggs. You'd probably have a cow that you'd milk. Many homes would keep a pig, which was their sort of recycling center. You'd buy a piglet every spring, you'd feed it all each year, and then in the fall you'd slaughter it. When these animals would get loose, there was somebody called the pound master, who would actually pick these animals up, take them to the impound, and they would hold them until someone would come to claim them. The pound master made their living by getting a redemption fee for the return of the animals. Alternatively, if nobody picked the animal up, he was allowed to keep it and either sell it, or he could keep it for his own family. So if it was a pig or a chicken or something, he could kill that animal and use it to feed his family. We did tend to see sometimes that dogs would show up. And interestingly, the early evidence we have is the dogs were basically put into some sort of a modified stall. The challenge with dogs is the fact that if nobody claimed them as their own, or if we also had the case that nobody wanted to buy the dog, adopt the dog, what was the pound master going to do? Our culture did not eat dogs. And so what happened was they were often killed, and they were killed in a variety of really horrific ways. I'll mention some of those a little bit later. And things didn't begin to change for what happened to animals until the middle of the 1866. Henry Berg, his father was an American shipbuilder. He was a diplomat. He served in St. Petersburg, Russia. And he founded the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, basically swiping the name from the RSPCA, the Royal SPCA. And in fact, he had met with those folks on his way back from Russia. The early work in the humane community in America was really based on horses. What we saw were the world, New York, big cities, depended on horses for transportation, for everything that needed to be done. And they were looking at the care of the horses. And in many cases, what was happening is horses were badly mistreated. And in fact, sometimes what would happen is if a horse was injured or went lame or something, they would just take it out of its harness and leave it in the street to die. So in fact, ambulances for horses were introduced before ambulances for people. If a person fell down, you could just pick them up and put them into any kind of a carriage, right? But a horse, you needed something special. And you can see in this photo here that the slides that were invented, which we still use in horse rescue, basically a sled that comes out of the back of a horse ambulance. You get the horse onto it, and you can just crank them up in. That was the way we would transport horses. The horses were taken to a dispensary, and there would be some care for them. Or alternatively, in many cases, they would be humanely killed. There was some attention paid to dogs. Though it's interesting, Henry Berg was mocked in many of the cartoons and the caricatures of the day because he actually cared about what happened to the dogs that were going to the New York City dog pound. And here's an example of what we're seeing. The other thing to keep in mind is in this day, the way the dog pounds operated, there was a lot of corruption involved. The pound masters, again, were still being paid for redemption. If you picked up a real honest-to-God stray on the street, nobody was going to come for that dog. So you did a lot of work and you weren't going to get compensated. So what they started to do was actually kidnap dogs. They would go to somebody's yard, take a dog that they knew was well cared for, they'd pick the dog up, take it to the pound, and they'd give some kid a nickel to run down the street and tell the people, hey, mister, your dog is in the pound and you better go get it before they kill it. So the guy would come down, pay to redeem his dog, take his dog home. After this happened several times, the pound master might suggest, well, if you slipped us a couple of bucks once a week, your dog probably wouldn't end up here so often. So it was a very corrupt type of activity. So you had the problems of how the dogs were treated, but you also had the problems of how the place was being operated. Some of the other early work on dogs in the humane area were the cart dogs that were used in the city. And in addition to the working cart dogs, there were spit dogs. Hotels and restaurants would have small dogs, and they basically ran in a hamster wheel, and they would turn a rotisserie, and this is how you would be cooking. So Boston Market, that would do their chickens, instead of having it plugged into the wall, they'd have this little terrier kind of dog running in this turn spit. And dogfighting. We saw that dogfighting was incredibly popular. In fact, it was seen in some ways as a tawdry but a okay thing for people to do. And what we would see is these pits, and it's interesting because you'd see all levels of society. And in these pits, Kit Burns was famous for a place he operated in the Bowery of New York City. And he had dog fights. He did ratting, where you would put terriers into the pit with rats to kill the rats. And you can see the guys back there with their top hats. A great representation of this is if you've seen the movie The Great Train Robbery with Sean Connery. Part of that is people going to a ratting event, and you see the way the terriers are with the rats. The first humane animal shelter in America was founded by the Philadelphia Women's Auxiliary of the Pennsylvania SPCA. Carolyn Earl White, who was the founder of the Pennsylvania SPCA, because of the way the world operated in those days, she was not allowed to be on the board of the SPCA, so she founded the Women's Auxiliary. And that organization actually still exists as the Women's Humane Society just outside of Philadelphia. But in 1874, they actually founded a new shelter for the strays that they were finding in the city. And what they did was provided medical treatment for the first time. And keep in mind, veterinary medicine was just beginning to evolve in some of these areas as a formal discipline, just moving away from the fact that you were relying on farriers for everything. You've had the first veterinary colleges are being formed. And at that time, you're still talking about that most veterinarians were doing large animal work. This is still a time when companion animals were not a significant part of veterinary medicine. They did place some animals into new homes, and they began to work on the concept of what we would think of as a more humane method of euthanasia. At the time, some of the ways that animals were euthanized were, it's hard to say euthanasia, which means good death, right? So we were killing them by drowning them, clubbing, strangling. This is a woodcut from New York City. Once a day, they had a big iron cage on the east side. They would load it up with dogs, swing it out over the East River, and drop it into the river. What's striking, and I think one of the things just to keep in mind throughout this entire talk, is how we think today and how different it is from how we were thinking back then. In a time when we think about no kill as a goal for a community regarding companion animals, people didn't think this was a terrible thing. And in fact, people would go down, hey, it's a nice afternoon, let's go down to the river and watch them drown the dogs. It was not considered a bad thing. Some of this began to change as a result of the work in Philadelphia. In 1894, interestingly, the city of New York understood they had a problem with their shelters, and they kept on asking Henry Berg, why don't you take over our animal shelters? Berg was a very smart guy, very well connected. He understood that the city was going to lowball how much they would pay him to run the shelters, so he always refused to do it. And he also thought it would interfere with all the other work of the society. Berg dies in 1888, and in 1894, the ASPCA board agrees to take over running the shelters in the city of New York. One of the first things they did with that was actually, with that initial transition of the duties, was also the implementation of a dog licensing program. And that dog licensing program was going to be used to fund the animal shelters. So the shelters were no longer dependent on the redemption fees. As a result, the people who went out to find stray dogs, they were getting paid by the dog license fee, not by redemptions. Interestingly, they actually were very successful because they actually caught more strays. And keep in mind, at this time, with the horses on the street, stray dogs were a real problem. They were a public health issue because dogs would harass the horses. You would have these waves of rabies coming through cities, and so there was a real concern. Strikingly, when the ASPCA presented the program, and within a year, they actually killed more animals than the pound had done the year before, the papers in New York praised the ASPCA. I mean, I can't imagine a shelter nowadays being praised because they've killed more animals than they did the year before, but got to keep in mind the context of the culture and what we were trying to accomplish. Here's an example of how some of the progress went in the development of humane euthanasia. It's a big steel box opened in the front. You can see the cage that rolls out. Dogs or cats would be put in there. It would be infiltrated with illuminating gas. This is the stuff this is the gaslight era, so this is what they were lighting their houses with. And it was derived from liquefied coal, and it asphyxiated the animals. Again, we don't think this is such a great thing, but compare it to drowning, compare it to being strangled or hit in the head with a club. Interestingly, though, a lot of the elements of animal shelters didn't change much for a century. This is a 1950s photograph of an ASPCA shelter. That looks an awful lot like a horse stall still. You see a bunch of dogs in there, different sizes. One of them you can see in the foreground there's got a collar. Small dogs in the back. And so you're seeing the way, and there were a lot of shelters, interestingly, in those days that would often have 7 kennels. Wow, 7 kennels, what's that mean? Well, there was 1 kennel for every day of the week. And every dog that came in on Monday went into the Monday kennel. There was a Tuesday kennel. When you cycled around the other side of the week, on Sunday, you would kill everything in the Monday kennel so that you could clean it out and have it available for the Monday load of animals that would come in. We started to see some changes really in the 1970s. Some of the things that happened then were the introduction of intravenous euthanasia. And this is still a work in progress. There are still places in this country where people are using carbon monoxide chambers for euthanizing animals. The elimination of pound seizure. In the years after World War II, this is the time when the biomedical community in this country exploded. We saw funding, we saw a lot of work being done in biomedical research, and they needed subjects. The scientists at the universities, in the medical schools, looked at the shelters and said, you guys are killing all these dogs and cats, give them to us, we'll use them for subjects. And so there were laws passed across the country that required shelters, if a university requisitioned animals, they got to come into the shelter and pick as many animals as they wanted. And this was a significant problem because the animal welfare movement still retained a strong anti-vivisection element. At the same time, members of a community would lose faith in their shelter because they felt that if they took an animal to a shelter, that it would either be adopted into a new home or given a humane euthanasia. But they didn't want to think about the fact that they were going to go to a laboratory, to a vivisector, where potentially terrible things would happen to them. Interestingly, one of the pieces of evolution that we see at this conference is in the 1950s and 60s, scientists came and took dogs from the shelter to the university. Now what we're seeing is that scientists at the university are going to the shelter to study the dogs, which is sort of an interesting change in position and focus. We also see that spaying and neutering animals begins to gain ground to address the question of homeless animals. And for those of you down under and elsewhere, we call it, desexing, which I've always thought kind of an interesting term. One of the things that began to happen is this question of, well, one of the ways we can manage what's happening in our shelters is thinking about how to manage the population of animals outside of our shelters. And so population management became something of a focus. And, at times there were, public education programs that used very dramatic photographs, barrels of dead animals, things like that. Though it's interesting, there was very limited published information. There was a lot of rhetoric about pet population and these things, but there was very little published information. And in fact, groups often made reference to one another. That group says that there's 10 million animals being euthanized every year. And then another group would say, well, 10 million sounds good, but if we said there's 12 million, that would make it seem more urgent. And so people would constantly repeat these, and it would be a cycle, and you couldn't really quite tell where the truth was. The best guess, and I've talked to folks like Dr. Andy Rowan at HSUS and others, is maybe around 1970 there was a peak. About 20 million animals were being euthanized in shelters around the country. And that estimate is as low as 13 million. I've seen it as high as 25 to 30. I'm comfortable with 20. I mean, we're picking a point in time and saying, let's just pretend that's there. At that point in time, it's about 100 animals per capita, 100 animals per 1,000 people. And it was described as a huge and an enormous crisis and a problem. So if you have a huge crisis, an enormous problem, you got to do something about it, right? You got to look forward. You got to meet with important people. And I started at the ASPCA in 1988. I found in our shelves, a bookshelf, this book called The Overpopulation of Cats and Dogs. It was a national conference that was held in New York City. They had all of the leaders in the humane world in the United States at that meeting. John Kohlberg, who was actually the guy who hired me at the ASPCA, Ingrid Newkirk, I think people know from PETA, Christine Stevens, founder of the Animal Welfare Institute, Wolfgang Jockle, who just recently passed away, really one of the leaders in understanding dog and cat and other animal reproduction. Tom Reagan, Gretchen Weiler. Strikingly, you look in the book, there isn't a single data table. Not a single data table. What you have is people arguing about who's at fault. You would have people saying, well, the reason we got this is because veterinarians charge too much money for spaying and neutering. And then you've had the American Kennel Club saying it's because shelters don't do a good enough job with adoptions. And then somebody else would be saying it's because the AKC breeds too many animals. And they kind of just went around chewing on each other's tail. So let me show you some graphs on some interesting stuff. I said we're looking at this population management. Shelters have been around since the 1870s. There's a utility called Google Engram. Google has digitized a zillion books. You can put in search terms, and it will tell you the relative frequency that these terms show up in their books, their publications. I put in pet overpopulation and spay neuter. I have no idea what's happening around 1930. okay? I mean, some drunk veterinarian saying something somewhere, right? But if you look, it's in 1970-ish that we start to see an uptick, and about 1988, and that's not my fault because I started at the ASPCA. Let me give you a couple of inflection points. SpayNeuter Clinics, the first ones are founded in Los Angeles and then New York and elsewhere around the country in the early 1970s. And in fact, in 1973, the ASPCA had an incredibly controversial change in their adoption policies. You would actually have to agree to spay or neuter an animal you adopted at the shelter. This was the first major sheltering organization to make that requirement. It was so controversial that Gretchen Weiler, who was on our board, and Gretchen was an actress, she went on to like the Mike Douglas show to explain this. And Mike Douglas, for those of you too young, was Oprah before Oprah, okay? Right? Some of you guys probably saw Mike. The other thing that happens in 1989, Ed Duvin publishes an article called, an essay, In the Name of Mercy. And he essentially shides the sheltering world, the humane world, with, you guys aren't being proactive. You're sitting back in your shelter behind your counters, and you're just letting people bring you animals and you're killing them without asking any questions. You need to do something about this. You need to actually be proactive. You need to try and do something to reduce those numbers. In many ways, that essay is the philosophical foundation for what becomes the no-kill movement. I'm not saying it created it, but it reflects the changing culture and philosophy that people had. And it really sort of is a demarcation point. And you can see the way you rapidly increase the attention to this. So here's an interesting graph of real honest-to-God data. When I joined the ASPCA, I was the head of education. My office was in the basement of the building. And I found in this closet all of these metal bins. And it turned out it was the ASPCA archival material. I'm the only person, I think, who has now read 149 ASPCA annual reports. We're celebrating the 150th year right now. I went through, strikingly, from the time the ASPCA took over that animal sheltering, animal control program in 1894, it published in the annual report the number of animals who came in and the number of animals who were euthanized. So I have like over 120 years of data. You can see the way it goes. That odd thing in 1904, I mean, I keyed these to US Census reports as well because I'm graphing per capita euthanasia. That odd little twitch, I don't know if anybody has a guess. It's when New York City changed its structure. New York City used to be Manhattan, and in 1899, it combined all the boroughs. Brooklyn was its own city, so we saw the population of New York, massively increase. So that's why you got a change in the per capita. But what you're seeing is an increase. The peak you see around 1915, early 1920s. The highest number of actual animals was, surprise, during the Great Depression, 1929 and onward. In that area there, look above 1928 to 1934. I'll give you an idea of how many animals that is. About 300,000 animals a year were being brought into the shelters. It was about 200,000 cats and about 100,000 dogs. Of those, about 280,000 were being euthanized each year. It was a massive, massive assembly line undertaking. What's striking is you see this chart begin to decline, primarily in the years after World War II. If you remember my graph that I just showed you previously, if you look at early 1970s, at that 74 number, you see a decline, and then later, again, more. But I'm interested in that decline from 1946 down to the 1970s. And I think it has to do with what Hal Herzog is going to talk about after me. If we think about that era, post-World War II, was the creation of what we now know as the modern pet-owning culture in America. Several things happened. We saw the creation of the suburbs. The GI Bill sent a lot of guys to college. You know, we saw the first suburbs built out in Long Island. All of a sudden, people who are living in apartments are living in single-family homes with a lawn and a backyard. We saw the media, Disney. We're talking about Lady and the Tramp, Old Yeller, Lassie is on television. We're seeing this concept of the American family includes a dog. The other thing that's happening, if you've watched Mad Men, it's the creation of the American consumer brand culture. Before World War II, there were very few national brands. Most of the things you bought came from a local supplier, local manufacturer. You know, if you were in New York, you bought one kind of flour. If you were in California, you bought another kind. What we saw with Mad Men was this creation of brands and also the advertising to support them. If you're old enough, you remember watching Bonanza and Lauren Green with his Alpo commercials, right? And he was there with that can of Alpo and said, "Feed your dog real meat from the can." Remember, before this, people used to feed their dogs leftovers. You know, whatever you had left over, you scraped in a plate, some bread crusts and everything else. But if you were a real pet lover, your dog got scientifically formulated horse meat in a can. And that was the creation, really, in some ways, that drove the growth of pet ownership. We saw the numbers of pets, dogs in particular, growing. But strikingly, at the same time, we saw the numbers, at least in New York, going down. And in some ways, it had to do with changing the way I think we were thinking about. It's harder to take a family member to the shelter than it is to take the dog who lived in the backyard behind the woodshed. You see, all the ways down there, I think I have the most recent number from 2014 and 2015, obviously not yet. New York, right now, per capita, it's less than one dog and cat, one animal per 1,000, okay? Which right now is about the lowest in America of any major city. And the national number is somewhere in the 10 to 13 per capita range. Obviously, we see great variation. Some communities are doing pretty well. Northeast of the United States is doing reasonably well. The Pacific Northwest, some areas of California, some areas up around the Great Lakes. Southeast, Southwest, not so much. So the next decades of change, 1990 to 2010, what we're seeing changes in shelter design. We're seeing, interestingly, a lot of shelters got built in those new communities. You know, as we were building those suburbs, they realized, well, you know, we need all the services that we used to have somewhere else. So in some cases, they did a pretty slipshod job of building shelters. Strikingly, I have been in, I don't know, it's got to be at least 1,000 shelters at this point in my life. Some of the neatest ones I've seen were the ones that were built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I mean, some of those are really neat because when you go into some of those, you realize, I mean, in some cases, what they did is, you know, that era when we were doing a lot of public works, and they brought in craftsmen, skilled craftsmen from Italy to do marble facades and everything. There's parts of the New York City subway that are just beautiful. I mean, there's mosaics and things down there that are incredible. Well, once these guys got done building Town Hall, sometimes they got brought in and they built the town shelter in 1910. I've seen some of these shelters. They have got marble floors that you would just die for, right? You just cut a chunk out and put it in my kitchen. It's that nice. Some of the ones built in the 50s and 60s, galvanized steel fencing, cinder block painted with cheap paint, not so nice. So what we started to see in the later years, people started thinking, these places are deteriorating, we ought to build something new. We saw some new designs. We see behavior programs being introduced, and I'll talk more about those. Changes in spay-neuter services, customer services, the adding of technology. I'm going to show you a research project later on. When I first started doing research in the shelter, we used to have to go up to the front desk and grabbed this big book, this binder of intake slips. And we then had to take it down into the basement overnight because they needed it the next morning. And we had to just tick off. We had to count by hand how many dogs came in, male, female, breed. All that was done by hand. None of this was done by computer. So we saw the introduction of actually computerized databases for shelters during this period, which has changed a lot. Though alternatively, and I'll tell you this, and my wife works in the insurance industry. She's a certified data manager, and she talks about data quality all the time. Boy, you know that old thing, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out? If the people put crummy information on the paper and you haven't trained them any better, they're going to put crummy information in using the keyboard of your computer. Because the other part that we have to work on is training the staff what data to put in and how to put it in appropriately. And then we saw the emergence of animal shelter medicine as a specialty. This is striking. So enhanced customer service. Wow, one of the interesting things was, if that shelter of ours is over by the garbage dump, what if we put a bunch of animals into an RV, drove them into the town park on Saturday afternoon, and did adoptions in the park where the people are? We started to see, okay, the shelter is open from 8 to 4 every day, and we're closed on weekends. Well, that's not really helpful if people are looking for a lost dog in your shelter, because they're probably working 9 to 5, and they're not going to be able to make it to your shelter. If they got their family and they want to come looking for a pet, man, Saturday's probably a good day to be open, right? I mean, that's when, Target is open. So we saw people starting to think about customer service and being a service provider. We saw changes in the design, more attention to space, new materials, easier to clean, disease management, aesthetics. I mean, this is a cat thing. I mean, let's face it, we can be a lot more whimsical when we do cats than we do for dogs. Cats don't usually chew up stuff as much. My colleague, Dr. Miller, carries with her when she does some talks on these things. She has a stainless steel bowl that's been chewed to pieces that actually was in with a pit bull. So when we think about durability, I don't know if there's some dogs I wouldn't put into that room. Shelter design also. We started to look, wow, one of the cool things was, remember that first picture I showed you, all those dogs in that stable? After World War II, veterinarians got really, really involved and said, you know what, disease spreads. So then we needed to start putting all of our dogs in individual stainless steel cages to separate them. So we took social animals and let's separate them to prevent disease from spreading. Now we're thinking, well, you know what? We probably have a sense that more of the dogs are going to die because of bad behavior than parvo. And we can inject against parvo. We can inject against distemper, but it's a little more difficult. The best vaccination for poor behavior sometimes is another dog. So try and put them together. Better locations. We started to finding, at least putting satellite locations for shelters in parts of town where people are coming by. Open and airy things. And, we got playgroups. Animal shelter medicine. Sort of begins with a course that was initially taught. Dr. Jan Scarlett, Lila Miller, and myself taught this course at Cornell. It was one of those interesting things because we talked to the dean and, explained what we're going to do. And the question was, what the heck is shelter medicine? And we said, we don't really know yet. Give us a break. Let us teach the course and we'll figure it out as we go. And actually, many schools have now picked up this concept. It was a track at a lot of veterinary conferences, North American, Midwest, and others do a track on shelter medicine. The Association of Shelter Veterinarians was formed, and in 2010, they published a very influential guidelines for standards. It's really best practices for shelters. For people around the world, you can find this, and it's a downloadable PDF. It's incredibly helpful. Interestingly, they built that guidelines on the 5 freedoms. The expansion of what was originally developed for the farm animal work coming out of the UK. its application to companion animals in shelters. So that's a really nice piece where we're taking work that was already done and building on it. Veterinary Information Network is an online CE, continuing education program. They began to offer work. And a textbook. We did the first one in 2004. Again, Lila and I had this idea for shelter medicine, and we had this proposal that we went to a number of publishers for. And it was very interesting because Roger Karras was the SPCA president at the time, and we were talking to him about what we were working on. And again, it was the question of what is this? And I said, well, we're kind of putting it together as we go. And Wiley was at Iowa State at the time, took a flyer on it, and we had thought it would have a niche. Oddly enough, we sold 10,000 copies of that book. We're not Stephen King, but 10,000, if you're a college professor, you know it's a pretty good number. It actually turned out to be the best-selling textbook, veterinary textbook in the history of the company. So we did a second edition in 2013. What's been really interesting is that the American Veterinary Medical Association has recently approved the development of a specialty college now for shelter medicine. So if you think about this, we're starting a field in 2000. In 15 years, they've moved to a point where it's going to be a recognized specialty within the veterinary community. I mean, I can't imagine something else happening that quickly. That's pretty remarkable. SpayNeuter, we saw a lot of changes. I tell people, I had my first dog for my 7th birthday, 1962. My father says we're going to get her spayed. And so she goes to the veterinarian. She comes home. She's got an incision that goes from about here to there. It's sewn up with piano wire. And it was very strange for me because she was the only spayed dog in town. And I remember Dad telling me she was fixed. And I couldn't figure that one out because all my friends, their dogs had puppies. And mine didn't have puppies. So she couldn't have been fixed. She must have been broken. There was something wrong with her, right? But what we're seeing now is the actual surgery is changing in process. Veterinarians are now doing spays with an incision like that, and it's taking them moments. Something called HVHQSN, high volume, high quality spay-neuter. Specialized programs, a veterinarian with proper support, dedicated to doing these surgeries, trained to do these surgeries, can do 30 to 40 surgeries in a day. It's amazing to watch them. We're talking about them being able to do these surgeries in 5 to 10 minutes. It used to be half an hour or more for a veterinarian. And now the introduction of some non-surgical methods of contraception or sterilization. NeuterSaw, which is a zinc gluconate product, was originally introduced. It's now been reintroduced as Zuterin. It's an injection into the testicles of a male dog, and it permanently sterilizes that dog. What's striking about this is the fact that Jim Haas is going to talk about funding. Gary Michelson, Dr. Gary Michelson in California, is from the Found Animal Foundation. He's offering $25 million prize to somebody who develops a permanent non-surgical sterilization system for dogs, cats, males, and females. And he's providing $50 million in funding. The behavior programs. We saw essentially the introduction of evaluations, enrichment programs, training programs for the dogs, helplines, and we have a textbook that just came out. One of my interesting things with veterinarians, of course, is what I call a toy, they call a fomite. Fomites are objects that can transmit disease between individuals. And so I think it's great for dogs to have a Kong toy. They say that's a way of spreading disease. Again, it's one of those things we work with them on that concept. Some of this tracks what we're seeing in the development of applied animal behavior. 1974, Tuber, Hothersall, and Voith, they propose, hey, let's have essentially an applied psychology of companion animals. We see behavior programs starting at animal shelters. 1991, ABS begins its program for certification. And in 1990s, we start to see some behavior evaluations in shelters. I'll show you the first one that we did. Evaluation of canine behavior to facilitate shelter adoptions. I presented this at Animal Behavior Society. It was really interesting. I had applied for graduate school for John Paul Scott. I didn't go there. I stayed in contact with him. At this particular meeting, I had this poster. Paul comes by. he says, hey, how you been doing? And I said this, and he goes, that's really cool. He gets a chair. He actually got a bottle of wine, and I said, gee, we're only supposed to get glasses. He says, I'm Paul Scott. I can get a bottle of wine if I want. So we killed a bottle of wine talking about like the dog behavior. So it's one of the highlights for me. This is one of those slides you're never supposed to do at a talk, right? All this little tiny words and everything else. But I just wanted to see, this is how we collected data, right? We did not have iPads that we could plug the data into or anything else. It was all the information about who was doing the evaluation, kennel number for the dog, size, breed type and stuff, and then the behaviors that we were looking at. Here you can see a little bit better. Here's some of the behaviors that we looked at. We looked at 11. And, let's face it, I'm putting this up here and I'm exposing my soul. I mean, some of this is pretty naive, right? We're looking at dominance. We're looking at confidence and sociability. And you can see what we have here is the sociability, aloof to social. We have this. And interestingly, we also, I just decided we also had landmarks for each of these for scoring. So for sociability, we had the dog on a leash. You call to the dog does not respond is a 1, several calls required. 5 is an immediate response and the dog comes to you. You can see for confidence what we have as well. And then we also had adoption recommendations. Part of the concept here was, let's try and help place the right dog. And I know we talked about this a little bit this morning, this idea of maybe if we knew a little bit more about dogs, we can put them with the right home. And this has really been one of the goals of the evaluation programs. We saw the development of additional behavior evaluations. Assess a Pet by Sue, who is a co-author on this study. Safer and Caninality by Emily Weiss, and Matchup by Amy Marder. Primarily, these are used for placement options, identifying rehabilitation protocols, and euthanasia decisions. Sometimes, in the shelters, what we have to make a decision is that dog safe to put into the community? Is it safe to let somebody walk that dog where there's children, to have them out there? And alternatively, there are times there are dogs who are really so psychologically wounded that euthanasia, and now euthanasia used appropriately, is a humane death. Dogs who have some severe anxiety problems or other types of things, it's incredibly difficult to work with some of those and provide change. Rehabilitation really exploded in the years after the Michael Vick case. Interestingly, these are 2 of the dogs that were really, really nice. And if you know anything about fighting dogs, they ain't fighting dogs to begin with. Okay, fighting dogs they look a lot like the dogs like Dr. Lord showed. They're like 35 pounds, they're very lean. These are big husky jobbies. The ASPCA founded a rehabilitation center in New Jersey with St. Hubert's, and they're in fact building a new one in North Carolina. And its focus is dogs from hoarding and puppy mill cases. And really primarily what they see is a need to work on fear and anxiety issues, because these are dogs who have had very limited exposure to people and the world. And primarily, obviously, they're going to be using counter conditioning, desensitization, operant conditioning to help these dogs. Things they're working on are handling. Dogs who haven't been handled, you got to get them comfortable. Can I touch your foot? How are you going to trim the toenails if you can't touch the foot? Some dogs who aren't even comfortable being petted. Leash walking, what we see in a lot of shelters, teaching a dog to leash walk is super because it just makes that first couple of days at home with a new family a lot easier. Novelty. If you look at hoarding cases or the dogs are coming from puppy mills, they haven't been exposed to very much. I mean, they've been enclosed in a couple of rooms or in a single cage. Stairs are a revelation to them, okay? And in fact, one of the things when I worked with greyhounds was, that was one of the struggles for racing greyhounds is like they get freaked out by stairs and mirrors. In a lot of cases, helper dogs are great. Strikingly, these are dogs who often have been with other dogs. It might be 40 dogs in a one-room apartment. It could be all the dogs you're crammed into at a breeding cage at a facility in a puppy mill. So they're actually reasonably comfortable with other dogs. And so actually having a confident, easy-working dog, we're seeing, and what we talked about, social learning. So in some ways, this other dog we think is probably going to help. And socialization with people, getting them used to seeing people and being with people. Future directions. Well, the sheltering world, we've concentrated on this end of the dog for an awful long time, right? And I think we ought to work on this end of the dog sometimes. And the person part, the brain part of both ends of these guys. And there are some questions I have. I mean, I'd love to know. Spay-neuter is rare in Northern Europe, but they don't seem to have a pet population problem. And I've talked to some people who've done some research there, and what I've come down to is I've told people, apparently, when used properly, a collar and a leash is an effective prophylaxis. The other thing is, and I've done behavior consulting, why is it that house soiling, peeing in the house, is a significant behavior problem for some people, but for other people, I mean, I've dealt with families where half the family's been in the emergency room and they think the dog is just a little pushy, right? So, what's happening there? Let's look at canine cognition and behavior. Let's get a better understanding of the development of social behavior. Because one of the questions that we need to look at is some of the problems we see are they don't get along very well, either with people or with others. How about the development of how the bond happens? We heard this morning a little bit about the whole oxytocin thing and bonding between dogs and people. And this question of how do dogs understand the world? I mean, the question is, can we create a world that they will like if they don't really, we don't understand what they like? And in fact, this is an interesting picture because this is the swan song from Morgan, my dog. This was the last picture that I've had. He's passed away. He's been in 2 of my books, and so it was kind of sad. But that's actually the debut of my granddaughter, Megan. So you can see that, she's getting her beagle-ness together. Just here's my shameless plug, okay? This is the book that just came out. It's an introduction to dog and cat behavior is found in it. We have chapters on housing and husbandry for both dogs and cats that supports good behavioral development, training enrichment programs, and we actually have chapters on human behavior. How do people make decisions about the animals they're going to adopt, how we help them make the right decisions, and how we move forward on that. And that's it. Thank you.